Well, kia ora tātou everyone, nau mai haere mai ki tēnei panel. It's fantastic to have you here. This is the second of our Let's Do Even Better election panels. My name's Brendan Lane. I'm the campaign organiser for the Let's Do Even Better campaign. And it's been fantastic to actually have some policy to finally get our teeth into. So helping me do that today, we've got three guests, and because we're all still in lockdown in Auckland, we've got them joining us by Zoom. And so we've got Efeso Collins, Councillor, Auckland Councillor for Manukau. We've also got Vanessa who's the co-chair of the Auckland Action Against Poverty, and she's our housing researcher. So it's fantastic to have you here as well. And we've got Louise Delaney, and she is the chair of the Tax Justice Aotearoa. So welcome everyone, and it's fantastic to have you here. So let's just jump straight into it, because as I said before, we've actually got some policy to discuss this time around. And so the first thing that has come up and I think really struck out for us in the campaign was the announcement by National around what they'd be doing for, well, pretty much for property investors rather than for renters. It's quite surprising given how many people now rent in New Zealand. But National announced a policy where they would be removing the requirements for heat pumps. They'd be removing the restrictions on more than one rent increase a year, and they'd also be looking at the removal of the no cause eviction process as well. So very progressive, maybe not, policies there. But they did very generously say that the houses still had to have some basic insulation. So that was quite surprising. And then the second thing that really made us sit up and notice this week was around the announcement around how much the housing market had increased, even during a lockdown. We had 8 regions had record growth, record housing growth, and we also had the median house price in Auckland reach $950,000, which is just an astronomical amount of money. So I'll come to you first, Vanessa, if I could. I mean, surely these sort of things and this sort of policy would make, things even more tenuous and difficult for renters in New Zealand.
Yeah, well, the National Party represents the interests of landlords and investors. They tend to back policies which will put more power in the hands of landlords to charge higher rents for quite substandard housing. And many of our politicians themselves own investment properties. So it's no wonder that we haven't seen policies that come into place that actively challenge housing as an investment and drive rents down. And while there's been some progress made by Labor with rental reforms, such as the ending of no-cause evictions, as you mentioned, and the restricting of how many times landlords can increase rents a year, which National plan to get rid of, these don't go far enough to really challenge the private rental market and have failed to supply people with warm, dry, and genuinely affordable housing. And the second image you brought up, it's really interesting that the housing market has been relatively not affected by COVID-19, but it's also not surprising. So after the global financial crisis, we saw house prices dip for a little bit, but then a year later, they started increasing at a really, really significant rate. And this is because housing and land investment is often used as a way for our economic system to kind of claw its way out of crisis. And while this is really good for investors and landlords, and they benefit from this, renters who have seen a massive reduction in income and due to COVID-19 and are really suffering under this system, not able to afford their rents, getting into debt and facing eviction.
Yeah, and we can see that in the graphic we've just put up here, where 80% of households can't afford their rent, and so therefore having to make some real big choices about whether they go to the doctor, whether they fill the car, whether they actually even eat, which is quite a frightening frightening statistic there from the Renters Association. Efeso, I mean, these sort of figures and that would be quite familiar to you as a councillor out south.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me. We're talking, for Pacific people, 4 out of 5 don't own a house. They're either in rental accommodation or in state housing. So we've only got around 17% of Pacific people who own a home. That's decreased from around 30% around 15, 20 years ago. So we've seen a major decline in Pacific home ownership. So these are major challenges that our people face, and we're often the ones who are fronting the news, who are making the decisions between, well, do you put food on the table or do you pay the rent? The other issue here is it creates a very transient environment for Pacific people. So you see a lot of them moving around. We're often at the hard edge. We're the ones, Māori and Pacific homelessness are the people who are sleeping in garages, sleeping in their cars. So you see the really acute effect of the inability to pay for housing. So look, I commend the government in that we've seen an increase in the number of state houses. I'd like to see a much more ambitious plan, but that's a really good thing that they've done. They've increased the stock in this term of state houses. And I think that's great. What we've got to see is even greater ambition and more of that starting to happen, because it does have a really serious effect on Māori and Pacific families.
Yeah. And I mean, we've got another graphic coming up here about how many households are actually on the waiting list waiting for a state house, which is a staggering over 18,000 households are looking for a state home, and which is and it's been a huge increase since Labour's come in. There's been an increase, and I think to me it seemed as if a lot of that was people who had fallen through the cracks and had no longer been registered by the system were actually finally coming back onto the books. Would you say that's right, Vanessa?
Well, I know that the Labour government often talks about the wait list as being increased because of their kind of way of assessing people for their eligibility. But I would want to nuance that a little bit because the wait list I see is getting higher because people simply can't afford to pay for private rentals on the incomes that they have, on the really low incomes they have, and because of years and years of disinvestment in public rental housing. So the amount that the Labour government is building back, we were already in a place where we had seen like the stock diminish so much. And it's important to note that the wait list doesn't even account for the amount of people that are actually experiencing housing stress and housing poverty in this country. There's a lot of people who don't fit the eligibility, the working poor, people who might earn a little bit too much to be able to be eligible for public housing but are struggling in the rental market. So actually the figure is shocking that it's 18,000 people waiting, but it actually would be much larger if we counted the eligibility, those who are having a lot of stress and being able to afford private.
And then I guess the other thing that we're trying to get our heads around is that the government has made a whole lot of noise about how it's been involved in building so many state houses now, to the point where there's never been more state houses built since the 1970s. So how do we marry up the two figures?
Well, the government has agreed to build more state houses. So in the 2018 budget, they agreed to build 6,400. And then in the recovery budget, there was another 6,000 state houses and 2,000 transitional houses. But we had already gone to a stage, like I said before, where we had less housing stock because National sold off a bunch of it. The other thing is that the government are actually doing a lot of rebuild. So they're demolishing a lot of state houses and rebuilding new ones. And on that land, building a whole bunch of private market housing, which is actually out of reach for many of the communities in which it's being built in. So they are building more housing, but we've got to think about what the rate at which they're building enough public housing to actually deal with the crisis that we're facing. In these big, large-scale state housing regeneration projects like we're seeing in Māngere and Mount Roskill and Porirua, so the state housing gets demolished and in its place is a mixture of state and private market housing, as you say. And only about 1/3 of that land is being used to rebuild the state housing stock, and 2/3 of that land is being used to build either private market housing or affordable projects such as Kiwi Build. And this is the way in which the government is, offsetting the costs of rebuilding the stock, rather than actually investing money into building enough public housing in these areas to house the communities. Because what happens when you build a whole bunch of private housing in lower income areas is it actually drives up rents and it pushes people out.
What has the Auckland Action Against Poverty been doing in this space?
Well, Auckland Action Against Poverty's main campaign this year is actually fighting for livable incomes for all. So we're fighting for benefit levels to be increased to livable amounts because people who are on the benefit simply can't afford to pay rent, let alone bills and other necessities. And so we're fighting for that and individualising benefits so people aren't punished for being in a relationship, and removing all sanctions in the system so people aren't coerced into precarious work. But we know that in our struggles for increasing people's benefit levels, just like in union struggles for increasing wages, that money ends up just going into the pockets of landlords and towards bills. And so we are also really fighting for having a mass build in public rental housing, as well as really supporting what the PSA is doing around universal basic services, so that things like power and things like water are accessible and public, so they're not commodified and expensive for people.
And then I guess the other side of all of this build is also and what we've focused on as part of the Aotearoa Wellbeing Commitment is around making sure that those homes are not only fit for purpose, but are also energy efficient and well connected to the internet as well. So any thoughts on that, apart from it's a good idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really great idea. I think that if you look at some of the work that's being done actually by progressives in the United States about making public housing zero carbon, so that you're both combating the climate crisis that we're facing, but also ensuring that people aren't paying all this money in order to be able to survive, because people are having to turn off their power, and people, especially with disabilities and people with illness, are having to turn off their power in order to be able to afford to pay their rent, and we're seeing this. So, yeah.
I think just on that, Brendan, there's an issue around how we design our housing stock. So there's a social impact of where the government's building its state houses, as Vanessa's been saying, because you're taking communities out to replace the old areas where the houses were. So you're removing communities for a little while. They get disrupted because they're not at the same schools. We're trying to find them somewhere to stay in between times while we're building. We saw this happen in Glen Innes. And I think that disruption to the community can also cause quite a bit of social dysfunction, because people are away from schools, their marae, their churches. So there is a social cost that we're having to pay. And if we design our houses better, look, we've got to start thinking about accessibility into the ground floor, especially of apartments, because that's essentially the way we're going. But we've also got to consider intergenerational families, because for many Pacific families in particular, it's you have mum and dad, the kids, but you'll also have older parents staying too. So you've got to have wider hallways, you've got to have accessible bathrooms, lower kitchen sinks. All of that goes in, and part of the challenge is some developers don't want to pay the high money because they just want to build a cardboard cutout box of a house and build heaps of them and move on. So we've got to consider the design elements of housing too. Yeah.
So I think, and that sort of that comment about making sure that we're all part of that we're considering all the parts of the issue, I think is one of the things that we've been really thinking about, because when we talk about coming out of COVID and we talk about what it means to be part of the team of 5 million, we get the sense, especially as a union, that there was lots of really positive rhetoric around how the essential workers are doing a fantastic job. doing all this amazing work for us. The government is kept running and doing its important things by all these really important essential workers, and we're all team of 5 million, and we come back down to level 1. And I don't know about you guys, but I just felt that it took about a month before we all started going, oh yeah, we're all part of the team of 5 million, 6 million, but not you lot. You lot over there, you still have to, you know how you were paid crap before? Well, we're going to keep paying you crap. And I was just wondering, Efeso, what's your thoughts about whether there is actually a team of 5 million, or are there some who are continually on the sideline because they don't have the boots to wear?
Yeah, I enjoyed the rhetoric of the notion of the team of 5 million, but the fact of the matter is we're not a team of 5 million. I think when you look at issues around homelessness, our higher levels of unemployment, especially for more vulnerable communities who are struggling to put food on the table, who are making those kinds of choices, I don't think they've ever felt like they've been included. Even the housing, we talk now about a housing crisis. Māori and Pacific people have been experiencing the housing crisis for the last 30, 40, 50 years, but only now it's been given some real mainstream media attention. So I think we've got a whole lot of catch up to do, and that's been my issue, is I think people are really warm to the words of the Prime Minister and Dr. Ashley Bloomfield, and they want to be part of this team. But given the more recent occasion of how people have been picked on and they've been piled in on social media with the Pacific family in particular in South Auckland, it just says again, look, you keep to your little part of the world. Let's gate off. We've got this new thing of gated communities, because it means we can protect ourselves from the other. And I'm not sure how we really mould together to form greater cohesion in New Zealand.
Do you think there's perhaps a disparity in the way that there was the second wave was treated compared to the first wave? I was quite surprised that people went off to quarantine so quickly.
Yeah, it was an interesting kind of development, especially for us in South Auckland. Look, I think what perhaps the perception that we've had is when the first outbreak happened, the media wasn't describing it as Pākehā people predominantly who were older, who were in Christchurch. When it became a Pacific family that got it, suddenly we were using words like, Pacific family in South Auckland or in Mount Roskill. We were really starting to hone in. So I think that's what caused the alarm, because straight away we're targeting, I think it's a real kind of Western way to approach the world, which is to let's go after something. So for some reason we want to blame. Yeah, people were invited, even families out south were invited. Look, if you are showing symptoms, you can go into quarantine. And that was kind of new too, where we had all these facilities and a couple out in Māngere. But I'm still left I'm wondering a little bit as to what we were trying to achieve. And it just feels like the messaging has been changed. I was really critical of the Ministry of Health because they were working out how do we really support people, and there was no Pacific person who was on their review committee. And I think you can't just come out and say, let's all look after each other, and then not include the very people who are being seriously affected. So I think we've got some work to do to have better understanding, because you can't, otherwise you're just saying to people, you don't belong, you're not part of the group. I think we can do better. So
Louise, the big thing that came out last week and in your space as Tax Justice Aotearoa Chair, you'd be most excited about, is Labour's announcement around the new tax rate. 39% for those earning over 180,000. And so that's the top 2% will be pinged with we'll be getting some extra dollars off them. So, Labour presented it very much as you should be grateful you're not earning you're not having to pay as much as they do in Australia. and despite the fact that, Australia's got a few more steps, plus it's got a whole lot of other tax rates on top of that, we're still talking about the top 2% of New Zealand who own a massive, probably, 50% of the assets?
Certainly, the Labour policy, the income tax rate hike, was a very small step in the right direction, but just a small step, and one that will do very little, in our view, in terms of addressing what we believe is what both Vanessa and Efeso have been talking about. Tax Justice Aotearoa is basically concerned about what do we do in strategic terms about both poverty and inequalities and ensuring good public health services for everybody. I mean, that's the aim.
So if we look at, and I think this is the interesting thing that's come up, is looking at the differences between Labour's policy and, say, the Greens. Obviously, when we're putting forward the idea of Aotearoa wellbeing commitment, what we really want to see is also, how we're going to pay for it. And so Labour comes up with, some couple of little items, but the Greens, they've got a wealth tax there, they've got a couple of new brackets, and which still come in under what Australia would do, but they're quite confident about how much more additional money that would bring in. If we were going to compare the two policies, which is probably stronger, do you think, Louise?
Without going into one party against another too much, what
Feel free.
Aotearoa are about, what we're about is a whole of society approach to tax. And if you do one little thing here, such as income tax, as I think both Vanessa and Efeso have, or certainly Vanessa alluded to, what investors and landlords are going to do are just going to divert some of their income tax more and put it into property and other investments, other physical assets. So to be sensible and to be strategic and to ensure that people don't avoid what they ought to be paying, you do have to look at the system as a whole. And that inevitably means investments in assets, physical assets and other assets, whether it's, stocks or whatever, stocks and shares, other kinds of assets.
So, in the UK, we've got property and wealth taxes as a share of GDP up over 3%. In Australia, it's about 1%. OECD average, it's around 1.5%. In New Zealand, it's like barely hits the scale. How does that work?
We simply, in New Zealand, don't tax assets. We used to, in the very early part of the 20th century, have some kind of inheritance tax, have some kinds of gift kind of tax, and so on. But over the 20th century, that was whittled away. And indeed, inheritance is now a major cause of intergenerational inequality. We all know, we've all got experience, I think, of middle-income families who provide certain assets, whether they're education, helps with job, helps with houses, of a kind that is simply not possible for low-income families. So the way we tax wealth and investment, and we're not talking necessarily about massive wealth, but just simply the fact that you inherit the family house plus other investments, is a way of guaranteeing the perpetuation of inequality and unfairness. So I guess any party that comes up with policies that looks at tax as a basis for putting all sorts of elements in place which together work to ensure that those who have more contribute more, which is pretty basic fairness, and also ensure enough revenue so that all can benefit from what we hope are improved public services, which is at the core of the wellbeing commitments, but also at the core of what New Zealanders want. So it's a pretty obvious thing as far as we're concerned that we simply have to take a more strategic approach to assets, which amongst other things will help ensure that income tax raises, as Labour has proposed, will be more effective. Because otherwise, as many commentators have said, they will just channel their money in other directions, and they will also channel their money into trusts.
So that brings me on to my second question I had for you around when Tax Justice Aotearoa talks about openness and transparency. Is that what you're meaning about knowing where the money goes if it is being diverted off?
Knowing where the money goes is certainly one thing that's really important. We also want to know who owns the money, which is not clear in our system. We do not know.
Because of the trusts?
who controls trusts, and often we actually don't know who controls companies. Yes, you can look at the register of company directors and you can see who formally and legally owns them, but often those companies are owned by other companies, whether in New Zealand or overseas, or owned by trusts. So we don't know who owns things. We don't know the level of assets that people have. We don't know where they send their money. We don't know how much tax they pay, often, especially if they have overseas connections. We don't know what very wealthy people do with their money offshore of New Zealand, and we don't know how much multinational companies are channeling their money around in various complicated ways to avoid paying tax.
That's a lot of don't knows.
There are a lot of don't knows, and there are very obvious and easy, in theory, ways of finding out more. We need banks to tell us, to make available information about companies. We need registers of owners of trusts and owners of and formal and actual owners of companies, which we don't know at the moment. We want to know how we want multinational companies to ensure that on their websites they have full, open and transparent accounts of what they're doing with their money and where they're paying tax and how much. So there are a multitude of ways of making our system more transparent and amongst other things, ensuring that IRD can and the members of the public can follow up and make sure that people are not avoiding their tax.
So does Tax Justice Aotearoa focus on having a top number? Is your top tax rate number bigger than Labour's top tax rate number, or is it more just the principle of we want a wider spread of where tax is collected so that we can make sure that the inequalities you talk about are dealt with?
We've identified certainly a higher income tax than the Labour Party.
That's not hard.
Not much higher, but and not as high as some other countries. We've mentioned on the chart Australia. I'd also like to mention that many of the Nordic, North European countries that we often like to compare ourselves with for their provision of public services have top tax rates of up to 50% or more. So we're falling well short of that. In terms of a levy on assets, otherwise known as a wealth tax, we are suggesting a number of possibilities, some of which do resemble the Greens Party. In our paper on that subject, we've suggested, you could have either a 1% tax of assets, net assets, that's assets minus debt, of 1 million, which I know for an Auckland house owner it doesn't seem very much.
Yeah, well, when your average house price has just reached $950,000.
Absolutely. So we need to bear in mind all the time that we are not talking about that we are talking about assets minus debt.
Yes.
So if the average Aucklander that $1 million house has got is 3/4 mortgage. So we're talking about net assets minus debt. And again, a possibility would be a contribution from wealthy-ish people of, say, a 2% tax on assets over 2 million. So we're not talking about 2% of 2 million. We're talking about 2% of $10 or whatever it is over that $2 million. What I would suggest that we do is we focus on the system as a whole and focusing on sources of revenue which we don't otherwise now tap into at all, that is assets of the rich or assets of the more wealthy amongst us.
But Louise, if you do that, then they won't invest. They won't invest and there'll be unemployment and capitalism as we know it will collapse.
I can assure you, Brendan, that a wealth tax of 2% over whatever assets we have over $2 million will not be noticed.
Well, David Seymour, I mean, he is a cheerleader of those who are of perhaps the 2%. He was saying that it was just an envy tax.
Certainly, our position is that, of course, is quite the idea of envying a wealthy person is not the aim of the game, and this is certainly not the motivation for it. Our motivation is not anti the rich, it is anti-poverty.
Indeed.
And we need to think and keep in mind always, what can we do, what do we do about addressing poverty, about reducing inequalities, those stubborn inequalities which simply have not gone away and indeed may be increasing with the effects of COVID.
Indeed.
So let's just look at what we can do and to ensure that we become a bit more fair, address those inequalities that Vanessa and Efeso are much more eloquently described than I could. So how do we do it? So what Tax Justice Aotearoa offers is a strategy, measures to get to where we want.
Right. Okay, cool. Well, thank you for that. It would be good to hear from each of you about the one thing that the next government could do to really help New Zealanders to prosper and to participate in New Zealand. So, Vanessa, the one thing, or maybe it's one and a half.
I guess for me, I think that the next government needs to engage in a mass build of beautiful, secure, warm, accessible, and as Efeso said, multi-generational and zero carbon public housing, and progressively universalise it so the criteria open up to more people. And alongside this, the government must finance and support the building of papakainga by Māori for Māori. This could create well-paid union construction jobs and ensure that no person in this country is paying more than 25% of their income on housing costs. And the way we can do that, of course, is to tax wealth.
Boom.
Yeah, alongside what Vanessa's just said, so that's one thing, and I'll match it up with mine because that was going to be mine too. But I think a universal basic income, I can't remember what the Greens have called, there's some general minimum income or something. I think that's going to really support families. And if we look at the tax discussion that you've just had with Louise, which is a really insightful discussion, it reminds me of the team of 5 million. Whenever we talk tax, there's no longer a team of 5 million.
Oh, no.
Hey. And that shows the clear discrepancy in New Zealand, because the people who are screaming for the 2% and the media's outlets that are giving all of this attention to the 2%, they get all of this airtime. And in the meantime, the poor have no airtime. Had it not been for groups like Action Against Poverty, CPAG, and all of those other groups, you wouldn't have this kind of discussion. So I think if we're going to be true to the team of 5 million, let's make sure everyone's got a basic income that they can live on.
Oh, kia ora. Louise?
And my wish list, well, I strongly ask us all, both politicians, members of the public, small groups like us, to talk about, in a strategic way, what our tax system should look like, because the building blocks of our tax system will build a better society. And for that, we've got to have look at all of what tax can do. We certainly have to look at wealth in the sense of those who have contributed, have benefited the most from our society during lockdown, but before and during after. We have to ask those people to recognise just how right it is, how morally right. It's a matter of principle and ethics, as well as, boring old economics. It's right to contribute well to your society, our beautiful society where we're so much better off than anywhere else in the world. Yeah. So we need our society to be strengthened, and for that we need everybody to pay and contribute their fair share.
Oh. Hey, well, look, thank you so much, everybody. It's been fantastic to have you on and have your insights and your thoughts and hear what you have to say about these really important issues and how all of this sort of ties in with the Aotearoa Wellbeing Commitment as well. So Vanessa, Auckland Action Against Poverty, Efeso, fantastic councillor for Manukau, and Louise, Chair of Tax Justice Aotearoa. Thank you so much for coming along, and just wish you all the best for the next little while.
Thanks, Brendan.
Cool. Thanks very much to me too, and I hope we can perhaps continue these conversations about the wellbeing commitment after the election.
Oh, we will be. All right. Cheers then.